Good afternoon, everybody. I don't know what the weather's like where you are, but it's pretty grim here this morning. So hopefully I will be able to cheer you all up with some really lovely images. Don't panic. There is very little Edvard Munch, though obviously if one's doing a survey of Scandinavian painting, one can't really afford to leave him out. The Scream is now second only to the Mona Lisa in terms of being famous. But, you know, don't worry, the angst comes right at the end. So a lot of people ask me, how on earth did I get involved with Norwegian arts? Well, it's Scandinavian, but particularly Norwegian art in the first place. And the answer is working on cruise ships. When I had that famous phone call, you know, that you all long for, will you please come and work on Minerva? So I had visions of me sailing around the Mediterranean with a G&T in my hand, looking at, you know, Roman and Greek remains. But no, they wanted me to go to Norway. So that is how many moons ago I got involved in Scandinavian arts in general, and in particularly Denmark. So at the end, if we have time, you could admire my Georg Janssen jewellery. So this is an overview of Scandinavian painting from about 1880 to 1914. Obviously, the end cutoff is the First World War. Just want to remind you where we are. We tend to forget how remote the Scandinavian countries are, and also how diverse they are in terms of their geography. So the top map shows you the various capitals: Stockholm, Sweden, Oslo, Norway, Finland, Helsinki, right down on the Gulf of Finland, not that far from St. Petersburg. People tend to forget that. And then the irony of all of this, because we think of it as Scandinavia, but Denmark's actually really Europe. As you can see, it's mainland Europe. It's just above Germany and has a very different landscape. So the lower map sort of reminds you that the very mountainous areas are particularly Norway, Scandinavian mountains as they're referred to here on my map. And Denmark is very flat. It's made up of about 300 islands. Traditionally, we refer to Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark as the Scandinavian countries, but this is quite recent. Originally, it was just the big three: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and we sort of extended it to sort of be a blanket for this northern area. Do be careful, however. It's just like Great Britain. You have to be careful of national identity and patriotism. So don't, when you go to visit, remember that you are in different countries. In terms of their emergence on the art scene, it comes very late. Don't go to the north in search of the Italian Renaissance. You know, they really only emerge as a power when they begin to industrialize and prosperity comes, which is very much at the end of the 19th century. Norway was particularly poor, one of the poorest countries in Europe, until they discovered oil and gas, the headquarters, of course, being Stavanger. So for a long time, these countries were very much on the periphery of Europe in terms of art and culture. It was not just a revelation or a revolution in the fine and decorative arts, it was also one in music and literature. So we've got Grieg, we've got Strindberg, we've got Ibsen. So when we say that it was a powerful force emerging in the arts, we mean right the way across the board. So this is just to emphasize the different geographical differences between north and south. So Summer Day on Roskilde Fjord has become an iconic Danish image because it reminds you of the flatness of the land. Its many islands are joined together by tunnels, and we're going to be talking quite a bit about Jutland, which is one of the larger islands, which sticks right up into the north. It's sort of like a finger going up between the North Sea and the Baltic, because at the very top of Jutland was one of their famous artist colonies at Skagen. More of that later. Lauritz, Andersen ring. So please note the different way of spelling Andersen. This is with an S-E-N, as in Hans Christian Andersen. My Andersen is Swedish. I'm S-O-N, but unfortunately, my husband's family dropped the double S. There are so many Andersens and Anderssons that many of them have to add another place name. So Lawrence Anderson Ring, well, he actually came from Ring, so he added that to differentiate himself from all the other Andersens in Denmark. So here is the far north. This is the Lofoten Islands. Even they managed to produce a well-known artist at the end of the 19th century. This is Otto Sinding. But just look, just to remind you of the mountainous geographical difference, and the climate, obviously far colder in the north. We may be moaning about the cold at the moment, but I promise you above the Arctic Circle, you're dealing with a polar night, so it's dark for about 1 month around the winter solstice, and you're looking at rather fierce temperatures, below zero. The Lofotens are actually lucky; they're in the Gulf Stream, and given their height, they are actually relatively warm. We're also going to go on a journey from naturalism to symbolism. So this is a good example of naturalism. It has almost a photographic veracity in capturing the mountainous landscape, but also those rather charming huts buried in the snow in the foreground. So in the middle of the 19th century, we have realism and we have naturalism. But by the end of the 19th century, we've moved to something a little different. We've gone beyond the idea of naturalism into symbolism, where we try to find something poetic in the landscape. So Autumn by Helmut Oslund, who is Swedish, is a good example of this. You can also see that he's taken an abstract impression here of nature, stylized trees, the mountains and the lake, making a flat pattern, rather like wallpaper almost, in terms of him trying to create his poetic impression of the northern landscape. So it's a very complicated interweaving of the countries in Scandinavia. We have two underdogs, Finland and Norway. So Sweden and Finland were formed into one kingdom for over 600 years, until 1809, when we have a war with Russia. And the consequence of this is that Sweden loses Finland, and Finland doesn't gain its independence from Russia until 1917. So nationalism is going to be a key ingredient in understanding Finnish art at the end of the early 20th century. Same pattern applies to Norway and Denmark. They are also united until 1814. And then Sweden, ironically, under the Bernadottes, assumes rulership of Norway until 1905. All of the political, melodramas of the early 19th century are all to do with the Napoleonic Wars, which basically reshapes this area politically. So some of you might have been, I should say, shouldn't I? This, of course, is a wonderful view of the Geiranger Fjord in June, just to remind you of how short the summer is in the north. And if you've been to Geiranger Fjord, you might have taken the Flam Railway. This is quite an adventure, one of the highest railways in the world. And coming back down, you'll be asked to get out of your carriage, and then you'll stand looking at this wonderful waterfall, and then miraculously the rocks around you will start to sing, and you will be greeted by this character, who is the Huldra. The Huldra is a troll, and she may look beautiful and alluring, but gentlemen, she's very dangerous. She will enchant you and lure you to your death on the rocks below. One of the ways in which all of my Scandinavian countries will try to create their own unique identity will be going back to folklore and folk art, as we will see. So the Huldra, her job is actually quite demanding. She has to stand in that waterfall all day. So rather ironically, this femme fatale is usually played by a man. As my close-up rather reveals, he's also wearing Wellingtons. So much for the romance of the North. So wherever you visit, you're going to find a strong attachment to Viking legends. They've come down to us via Iceland, where they were at last transcribed. But most of the Viking sagas and legends were obviously an oral tradition. So Carl Larsen's Midwinter Festival at Gamla Uppsala Temple absolutely scandalized the nation when it was completed in 1915 to decorate the walls of the National Museum in Stockholm, but was firmly rejected. It wasn't so much that they disliked the idea of celebrating a pagan past. King Domhalder was unfortunately naked, and that's what appears to have upset people the most. It went into a private collection in Japan and has only recently been recovered by the state and is now in its original position as intended in the entrance of the newly restored National Museum in Stockholm. It has a sort of druidical feeling to it, doesn't it? We're now, of course, engaging in Viking mythology and legends. In Finland, they had the Kalevala, an amazingly complicated saga. And this is by Akseli Gallen-Kallela, who actually changed his name from its Swedish form into the Finnish version in order to, again, identify with this cultural mythic past. I won't attempt to tell you the story of the Kalevala. It's very complicated. Let's just say that it's very much like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. There are lots of quests, lots of ogres, and in this particular image we have a mythic swan in the background, and the mother is trying to bring her son, who is the hero, back to life. Whether you're looking at music or poems or the visual arts, there's this strong sort of image of the spirit of the nation. So this is a wonderful image by Akseli Gallen-Kallela, almost like a religious triptych with the magic of Finland in the center. You know, at this stage, you want to play the music, don't you, by Grieg or Sibelius, to sort of really bring that sort of romantic nationalism alive. In Norway, it's no different. Here, again, they draw very heavily on the Nordic sagas. This is Gerhard Munter. I particularly wanted to include him because this shows you how many were influenced by the English arts and crafts movement, and William Morris in particular. Gerhard Munter spread his wings and went beyond painting into the decorative arts. He creates one of the most famous interiors in Norway. This is the fairy tale room in the Holmenkollen Hotel, sadly burnt down in the opening years of the 20th century, so this room no longer exists. But we do have photographs of it, and most importantly, some of the artwork has survived. This is the sketch for what was going to be a tapestry entitled The Daughters of the Northern Lights. It's a love affair between a maiden and a polar bear, as you can see, but most importantly has got the Northern Lights in the corner. And legend has it, ladies, that if you stand under the Northern Lights, you're more likely to give birth to a boy. Hence the number of Japanese tourists that venture to stand under the Northern Lights. Whenever I've looked at this sketch, that on the left-hand side we have the sketch for the rug, or in fact it's a wall hanging bottom right-hand side, I'm always reminded of Beardsley. And all the artists that we are discussing today would have been familiar with artists like William Morris and Beardsley through international magazines like The Studio. Gerhard Munter is particularly famous for illustrating Snorri Sturluson's, don't you love these names, saga. It's written, as you can see, in the early 13th century, and was the first time really all these Nordic sagas were put down on paper. I wanted to introduce this because it's about trolls. So Usmund in the top is trying to rescue a princess, and he's got to fight against a lot of trolls. The bottom image is, of course, him rescuing the princess. It has a happy end. And not only does he get the princess, but he gets a lot of money as well as a reward. But trolls are very important. We've already met Mahuldra. She's a type of troll. And Theodore Kittelsen was particularly famous for capturing the spirit, the evil spirit of the troll. And in this case, the Noken, or water spirit. If you've ever travelled to the far north in midsummer, you'll know how spooky it is walking around at midnight in a sort of gloom. It's not dark, it's not really light, it's rather misty, it's incredibly quiet. And you can imagine in that sort of environment, all sorts of monsters emerging out of the forest, or in this case, out of the pond. So I wanted to remind you of the unique character of the Northern Light. This is Harald Schloch Muller. He is Danish. And on a summer's day here, we've got two ladies paddling, and the light, wherever, well, midsummer, it has a sort of clarity to it, but also a vaporousness, because of course it is, you know, a cold, for the most part, a cold climate. Summers are short, but luminous. I think that's the right word to describe it. And this again has become one of Denmark's most popular paintings. Again, it emphasizes the flatness of the landscape. Even more famous is Krøyer's Summer Evening on the South Beach at Skagen. Now, I mentioned this artist colony right at the beginning because it's on the northernmost tip of Jutland, North Sea on one side, Baltic on the other. It's rather like going to Walberswick in Suffolk. Vast sand dunes and an immense sky. And Krøyer, who is one of the leading artists of the Skagen Group, by the way, in Danish, you shouldn't pronounce the G, and you might recognize it as the brand of a watch as well, Skagen. There's this famous moment just as the sun is setting at midnight, you know, under the midnight sun, where you get this amazing blue hour, where particularly here, as you can see, the sky and the sea have become as one. And many artists were very attracted to the concept of the blue hour and capturing this magic light. It's not that easy to see the midnight sun. I had 4 adventures on Minerva, and I only saw it a couple of times because it's like any other natural phenomenon, all down to the weather. So here I am on Minerva. It's about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. I probably have got a G&T in my hand, and I'm celebrating the rarity of seeing an absolutely brilliant midnight sun at high summer. So if you're planning to go up there, always remember to take into consideration, if you want to see the midnight sun, you've really got to go in the middle of the year. June is best. So here's Akseli Gallen-Kallela again, Finland. I think he's one of the finest painters of snow. He was very influenced too by the Japanese print, which explains the rather dramatic cropping of this image. And I love the weight of the snow on this pine tree, sort of weighing it down. So the winter is the opposite of summer. It's long, it's harsh, you're very isolated. There's no popping out for a loaf of bread and a pint of milk. You've got to be pretty much on your own resources in the late 19th century. This is Fritz Fallow. He's again another Norwegian artist. Our woman here is rowing back to her homestead across the river Samoa. And it's just really to remind you that you are very isolated in the north, particularly once the snow comes. So given that many artists in the middle of the 19th century take up en plein air painting, you can see that there are going to be many challenges painting in the far north. En plein air simply means painting directly from nature out of doors. It was a revolution led in France by Eugene Janssen and Gustave Courbet, and came about because of a new technological invention from America, the collapsible metal tube. Prior to this, paints had to be mixed in the studio. It was very difficult for you to go out and about with oils. You could go out and about with a pencil and in watercolor, but it was much harder to go out and about with oils. So the top left-hand side is Krøyer painting on the beach at Skagen in midsummer. And as you can see, wearing a sun hat, but without the customary umbrella. You'll see one of those later. Artists often used an umbrella to create an even light over their canvas. Top right-hand side, Carl Larsen, Sweden's most famous painting, struggling not only with the snow, his paints might be freezing and his feet are certainly cold. He's wearing straw boots, but he's also got to put up with a lot of inquisitive villagers who are looking over his shoulder. Down the bottom is Andersen Ring again. He's got the same issue. He's having a chat to a local villager, but also painting in the snow directly from nature out of doors. He's also wearing rather fetching straw slippers on his feet. And bottom right is Harald Solberg. You might have been to the relatively recent exhibition of Solberg's work held at Dulwich. Dulwich is much more adventurous than many other galleries in England. They've also had an exhibition on the Canadian Group of 7, and you'll see some obvious synergies between Scandinavian painters and the famous Canadian Group of 7. Solberg there isn't just fighting the elements, he's also up there on that platform because he's got to worry about bears. So this is just to remind you that painting directly from out of doors is not as easy as it sounds. So this is the full work by Andersen Ring of the painter in the village. He was born on southern Zealand, which is one again of the larger islands in the sort of archipelago that is Copenhagen. And he's going to be very influenced by Ruskin. They all read Ruskin, by the way, John Ruskin and William Morris, and want to go in search of what becomes known as the good life. He lived in a series of villages, and we'll end up at this one here, Baldersbronda. And our only painting by Andersen Ring is in the National Gallery, is set in this village. Again, it's a winter's day. He settled here, this is Andersen Ring, and lived and painted in the village 1901 to 1913. So this is a bit like going to Newlyn, or the Glasgow boys famously going in search of Dumfries Shire, or painting in and around the Trossachs. If you're going to be a rural life painter, well, the obvious answer is you've got to find some rural life. So many artists abandon the city and go in pursuit of this idea of living a wholesome, simple life in the countryside. However, Andersen Ring realised that life in the countryside was in fact no bed of roses. He was very socialist in his outlook, very much wanted to depict the life of the peasant as it truly was. A struggle, really, let's be honest, against the elements and just, well, against everything, really, was always a struggle at the end of the 19th century. So the Sower here by L.A. Ring. And most of the images that I'm going to show you are in a major collection. Like, for instance, this is in the National Gallery of Copenhagen. We have very few of these paintings in the UK. So peasants were very important, not just for Andersen Ring, but really for the generation of the 1880s, as they were all influenced by perhaps the most interesting and influential French painter of the 1870s and early 1880s. This is Jules Bastien Lepage. He did not win the Prix de Rome, which was the prize that every French artist wanted to achieve, which would have allowed him to go and study Renaissance works of art in Rome. Licking his wounds, he returned to his native village of Domvilliers, which is in Lorraine, and he set about painting peasant life. So he's the peasant artist supreme, and many become his followers. He has a way of depicting peasant life, not quite warts and all, but certainly in almost a photographic reportage way. Les foins is their haymakers, and they are exhausted after their day's labour. He used photography a lot to help him. So October, which by the way is in the National Gallery of Victoria, Melbourne, you can see there that you could never hold that pose for very long. He had to use photography for the central figure, and she's picking potatoes. So he has a sort of a realism to depicting peasant life. Unlike one of his predecessors, this is Millet or Millet's Angelus, very famous work from the 1850s, but here they are saying their morning prayers before they start work. Lepage doesn't really try to inject any sort of spiritual element into his work, but there's a lot of what we refer to as social realism, showing what it was really like to work the land. Because Bastien Lepage and also the French Impressionists, remember that they emerged in the late 1860s, holding their first exhibition in 1874, 6 exhibitions altogether, taking us into the 1880s. Not surprisingly, many of my northern artists want to go to Paris. They want to enjoy the informality of the atelier system. They will develop a habit of going out at the weekends to paint at Grès-sur-Loire, which becomes one of the most important artist colonies operating at the end of the 19th century. It was close enough to Paris to go for the weekend or for long idyllic summers. It's a very international colony, as you can see. So many Scandinavian painters go to study in Paris, and they go to Grès-sur-Loire to practice en plein air painting. So we are part of this phenomena at Grès-sur-Loire. So the wonderfully named William Stodge of Oldham paints at Grès, as does John Lavery, who's one of the Glasgow boys. Richard Berg, who's Swedish. Carl Larsen is Swedish. Christian Skredsvik is Norwegian. Christian Kroger is also Norwegian. Carl Norstrom is Swedish. And Julia Beck is also Swedish. It just gives you an idea of just how international Grès-sur-Loire is, but also to remind you how important women are. Women are now at last emerging as, again, a powerful force in the art world. And this is Julia Beck's rather lovely image looking over the gardens at Grès-sur-Loire. So it's a struggle to survive at the end of the 19th century. And many of my artists, like Anderson Ring, are socialist in terms of their political leaning, particularly as in Norway, there was a very autocratic government in the 1880s, which led to political repression. So Christian Kroger here, Struggle for Survival, is showing you a group trying to grab that piece of bread or a loaf coming out of the window. And his sleeping mother is set in Skagen. She's the wife of a fisherman who has fallen asleep. The dawn appears to be breaking, and she's obviously tending her baby. And the whole thing is to remind you that it's a tough life, whether you're in the city or the country. And this Finnish artist, this painted by a Finnish artist, Eero Janfeldt, really brings home how tough it was working the land. Under the yoke, wage slaves. Reminds you that a lot of people didn't own their own land. They really did exist hand to mouth, that many rural children didn't go to school, and all things like this are pretty grim. This is in the Athenaeum, which is the principal art gallery in Helsinki. However, before we get too depressed, it wasn't all as grim as that. Yes, the life of the working peasant was hard, but many artists were seduced by this idea, you know, as in the English arts and crafts movement, that life in the countryside was more wholesome, it was healthy, you had a sense of community, there was a continuity between the different generations. So this is one of the so-called Fyn painters. Fyn is a sort of island between Zealand and Jutland in terms of understanding your geography of Denmark. It's an important island because it is from Fyn that Hans Christian Andersen comes. So this is Fritz Cyborg. He and his wife were leading figures in the Fyn artist group, and they were, you know, a very wholesome image. This is spring, we've got 3 generations. There's a sense of, you know, well-being in this image, which is very different to some of the images that I've shown you already. Or this one here by Peter Hansen, who's also one of the Fyn artists, where again there's a symbiotic relationship between man and the land, here with the turning of the plough, which could easily be a British Impressionist work. I could show you very similar things by people like Frank Bramley and Walter Langley. This is in the Fjord Museum. There are lots of local museums. The artist colonies, which spring up all over Europe, means that you have lots of local collections celebrating the way in which artists return to the land in search of en plein air subjects. So here's another artist colony. This is Varberg. This is Sweden. So we're just south of Gothenburg. I have a love-hate relationship with Gothenburg because every time I've been there, the art gallery has been shut, and I'm desperate to get inside it, as it has lots of works by my favourite artist, Carl Larsen. Anyway, Richard Berg and his family moved to Varberg, and they are joined by Niels Kruger and Carl Nordstrom. So they form their own little clique of artists. And this is a really interesting painting because this all has always a religious element to it. You've gone back to this idea that you can find in nature a spiritual dynamic, the hand of, of God almost, in this tripartite arrangement. It's more like a religious triptych. I want you to particularly notice how beautiful the frame is, because when we move into symbolism, which this is a good example of symbolism, the artist will move beyond the painted canvas to make the frame parts of his statement. The middle section, which I'm showing you here, the man ploughing in the middle distance, but most importantly, this clearly shows the influence of Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh dies in 1890. His brother Theo, I'm afraid, follows him shortly after. Theo's widow is left virtually penniless, so she starts to sell Van Gogh's works, but also to exhibit them all the way across Europe. So by the middle of the 1890s, most artists have seen a work by Vincent van Gogh and are duly influenced in terms of their own vision. Back to Harold Schloch Muller here, Danish, you remember, but the reason for showing you this is again this arts and crafts element, where the artist goes beyond the canvas and makes the frame part of a sort of decorative ensemble. So this is spring. We've got a young girl, sort of almost like a spring flora, almost like a goddess. She's got primroses in her hair. The birds are singing. She's got flowers all over her dress. And, it's the sort of spirit or essence of spring. This is carried over into the beautiful frame, which is enameled and marquetry work with leaves and little saplings that are gradually unfolding with the coming of the warmer weather. Symbolism, is a really interesting phenomena in the 1890s, a sort of this idea to return to the poetry of the landscape after the almost photographic realism of the 1880s, which you can see here. I've got On the Plain, or September, two versions of it, by Erik Werenskjold, one of Norway's most famous en plein air, or I should say really naturalist painters. In the top image, it's a single girl and she's looking out, perhaps thinking about her future. And the lower one, which is simply entitled September, well, the two girls might there again be brooding on their future. But they also sort of rather remind you that you're living in an idyll, all this beautiful natural beauty. And Christian Skredsvig's idyll, he lived, and there's a museum devoted to him in Hagen, which is near Telemark. So we're right again, sort of like North Norway. I don't know what the cat and he are looking at or what he might be about to squash under his foot. Questions on a postcard. But again, the title of this is simply an idyll. And Skredsvig again did, as so many artists did, he abandoned life in the city to live in his idyll, which was, a house which he had built for him in Hagen. So you get a lot of rather sort of moody, pensive young girls in a landscape. This is Andersen Ring again, and it may be his wife who modelled for the model Sigrid. Our model is blowing a dandelion clock. So again, it's supposed to be more than a simply transcribed landscape. There's a melancholic element or a wistful element as she's thinking about the passage of time. Summer will obviously, the winter season will come round. But again, rather like my Werenskjold images, she might be thinking of her future. Eero Janfeldt, we saw his hard-hitting painting earlier on of burning the landscape, but now something much happier. This is his wife, Sunny, in the meadow, 1892. And again, this is a celebration of nature as an idyll. So the naturalists, impressionists, they have this different way of looking at nature. It's not necessarily always simply about a photographic representation. This is Edvard Munch's Inga on the Beach. Inga was his sister. And here you see what I mean about the sort of pensive mode, a slight melancholia to the image. And we're supposed to imagine here that the sun is setting, and again, perhaps Inga is thinking about her future. Poetic melancholia. And that spills over into one of the great problems of the late 19th century, tuberculosis. So this was the great killer in the 1890s. It robbed Munch of his sister and of his mother. Christian Krog's The Sick Girl is particularly poignant. The rose losing its leaves might signal that in fact she's doomed, that there is no recovery for her, that her TB will be fatal. The Munch painting The Sick Girl, she is looking out of the window. Her mother has fallen asleep. And again, this may not be a particularly happy prognosis. Evidently, with TB, you have a moment of lucidity before the final end comes. You know, TB didn't matter, a bit like COVID, didn't matter who it had no class, it struck everybody, you know, and so many middle class families had to suffer losses just like the working classes. Michael Anker's Sick Girl down the bottom isn't quite so convincing, is she? It looks like she's just taken to her bed with her book. They were quite worried about girls reading. But again, the sort of veracity of the painting, you can see her medicine on the table next to her. And one of my main reasons for wanting to include this element is that some of you might have been to visit the Helena Schieferbeck Museum, Finnish artist. This is her most famous work, The Convalescent, and it lives in the Athenaeum. But you might have seen her work at the Royal Academy quite recently. The little girl here is going to recover. The metaphor, of course, is the twig that's coming to life in her little blue and white cup. If you went to visit this exhibition, you know that she's sometimes referred to as the Finnish Edvard Munch, but she is nowhere near as depressing, I promise you. But she did produce a series of very revealing self-portraits, which probably should mean that she's called the Rembrandt of Finland rather than Munch. Many simply want to celebrate the conviviality of the life in the countryside and all its great traditions. Anders Zorn was undoubtedly Sweden's most famous artist at the end of the 19th century. Sometimes we refer to him as Sweden's singer sergeant because he had such a brilliant technique, this loose, fluid, creamy way of painting. The Midsummer's Dance, and then Dance in Midwinter. It's that whole idea of the sort of happy community life in a Swedish village. And at this stage, by the way, remember, Sweden can borrow Norway. So you might actually be looking at Midsummer Dance at a scene in Norway, because till 1905, the two countries are conjoined. Carl Larsen, however, is the most famous for this idea of enshrining the traditions of a craft way of life, you know, practicing all sorts of crafts. Here on the right-hand side, there's a lady knitting, she's smoking a pipe, they're weaving and they are spinning. Larsen was very influenced by the English arts and crafts movement. He knew all about it from the famous magazine Studio. He was fascinated by painted furniture and the painted decoration, in fact, that he would have found in both Sweden and Norway in these beautiful homes. And he wanted to recreate that in his own home. He is famous for many reasons. He has a very talented wife. This is Karen. They form a sort of artistic partnership. She is able to sort of keep family and home together. 8 in her, children. So she's very busy working as a mother, but also holding Carl together. Like many artists, he's had a sort of a temperament that was prone to depression. So you see him here with his alter ego, little puppet that you often see him with. You can actually see Karen in the window over Carl's shoulder to remind you of how close their relationship was. So they wanted to create a perfect idyllic home life. She was from a middle-class background. He was from the wrong side of the Drax, Gamla Stan in Stockholm. Eventually, they will develop their country cottage into a farmstead, and his idyllic, or their idyllic way of life will become very well known through a series of illustrated books. A Home, published in 1889, and then it runs A Family, and then A Farm, because they really wanted to be self-sufficient. They wanted, like the English arts and crafts movement, to lead the good life. The front cover of A Home shows them all eating out of doors. This is Lilla, their house in Sudborn, which is this idyllic house with all its painted decoration. And here is the front of a farm, because, you know, it was really a whole lifestyle that Carl Larsen was promoting. In the books, it always seems to be summer, at least it does to me, here with crayfishing, which, by the way, is sort of like the Swedish national dish, as far as I can work out, particularly in high summer. And here are all the 8 children. She did have a nanny to help, just enjoying the outdoor life. And then the flip side of it, it's all about, you know, building a home. Larsen is seen to be the founding father of IKEA, don't blanch, and this idea of having the big table, around which all family life revolves. So here is Karen, lord of her kitchen, or mistress, I should say, of her kitchen, in this image by Larsen of 1901. And this one here of 1894, which has definitely become the lazing corner, the quintessential Swedish statement, the blue and white stripe, the homespun rugs, the painted decoration. You'll find this on many a Swedish wall, almost like a national image. So the Skagen Group was the most important colony to develop in Denmark. And in fact, rather like Grace Chirouin, many artists went to paint at Skagen in the summer. Some, like Krøyer, who you see here, will actually put down roots and stay there almost permanently. So the Skagen artists I'm going to concentrate on, because there are many of them, are Michael Anker, his wife Anna Anker, who was local to Skagen, and Peder Severin Krøyer, certainly one of Denmark's most famous artists, though he was actually born in Stavanger, Norway, just to confuse everybody. My list here is of other famous colonies. This is a European phenomena, not something contained in Scandinavia. In Brittany, we have Pont-Aven, that's the great colony, in effect founded by Gauguin. In the Netherlands, we've got the Hague School and Zandvoort. Elizabeth Stanhope Forbes painted at Stanford. Newlyn, obviously that's the one on your doorstep. Stanhope Forbes, Walter Langley, as you know, Newlyn, then it's Lamorna Cove and eventually St. Ives. This is England's most famous colony. And the Glasgow Boys, there's 26 in that group, and they will head in the summer to places like Kirkcudbright and the Trossachs in search of their idyllic landscapes. So at the top here, we have Michael Anker, his wife down below in the straw bonnet, Krøyer painting out of doors, and most importantly above, I promised you an umbrella. There he is painting on the beach at Skagen, and look at the size of his canvas. He is sometimes compared to the famous Spanish en-plein artist Sorolla. So inevitably in Skagen, Michael Anker is he's going to be famous for depicting the life of the local fisherman. Lifeboat taken through the dunes here reminds you of how precarious this occupation was. If you look right at the back of the canvas, there is the ship that is in the process of being wrecked, and they're going out to save. This is by Oscar Björk, launching the boat. He was one of those who went to Skagen intermittently in the early 1880s, but the chap pulling the boat ashore appears to have time warped here to Newlyn. I thought, making all these comparisons to Newlyn, I better remind you of the most famous of all, I think, the Newlyn images, Stanhope Forbes' fish sail on the Cornish beach, which, by the way, should be living out on a wall in Plymouth. It's almost exactly the same date, as you can see, and was also an essay in light, as well as the social realism aspect of painting the life of the fisher folk of Cornwall. This is Kroyer. He starts off very much painting the life of the fisherman, reeling in the nets, and he scored a huge hit at Paris 1889 with this type of social realism. But it's not long, in fact, before really he turns to an even more lucrative subject, and that's sort of painting the middle classes at play on the beach. One of my favourite works by Kroyer. It lives in the Hirschsprung collection in Copenhagen, and they are all boys bathing in the sea, but the little girl on the right hand side, fully dressed, is looking longingly at the boys whom she's not allowed to join and play with. Sort of gender consequences here, as well as obviously making you think about class. I don't know whether they are working class boys, middle class boys, or a combination of both. These two ladies are definitely middle class. This was Kroyer's wife, Marie Kroyer, and Anna Anker walking along the beach at midnight in that blue hour. It's one of my favorite paintings, and sort of typifies to me the Skagen school and this longing to capture the blue hour. It was based, of course, on a photograph, which it popped up for you. And some of these paintings are on a truly magnificent scale. So the best collection of works by the Skagen artists, and Marie Kroyer was an artist in her own right. The best collection is in Skagen itself. So there's a little girl here holding up her postcard in front of the painting. It's just to show you that it is painted on a truly monumental style. And again, it has a slight wistful melancholia to it, doesn't it? A lovely dress and that blue hour again with her red sweater. So light is a very important, I think, component in many of these paintings. In Anna Anker's painting here, the sort of light coming in through the door and diffused through that curtain. It's picked up in the sunlight in the blue room, which shows, in fact, her daughter, Helga, knitting in her grandmother's parlour. Although Anna was part of the Skagen Group, like many women, she still seems to have concentrated on interiors. But the important thing here is the light coming in through the window and that colour blue. And light coming in through a window was primarily the subject of Wilhelm Hammerstroy, who is sometimes referred to as Denmark's Vermeer, though given that his palette is grey and white, he could also be described as Denmark's Whistler, James Mcneal Whistler. Poetry of silence is how his exhibition at the Royal Academy a few years ago was promoted, and there is definitely a melancholic, slightly depressive element about Wilhelm Hammerstroy, but they are nevertheless quite fascinating. He paints doors and windows. So a series of open doors. These are often the doors in his own apartment in Skagen. A lot of them are a bit wobbly. Can you see they're wobbly because the apartment was 18th century? And the idea is that it's very Freudian. Your life is made up of a series of doors that you have to pass over the threshold, and you go through different phases. This is easy for women. You know, we're maidens, we're women, we give birth. Oh, hang on, we get married, we give birth, and then inevitably we die. Sorry to be depressed again. However, perhaps if you're into film like I am, and the way in which film is often influenced by painting, if you've watched The Danish Girl with hang on, I'm trying to remember the name of the actor, Eddie Redmayne, in the title role as the first transsexual. Again, don't let that put you off. It's a very beautiful film, but most importantly, it's a Wilhelm Hammerstroy painting come to life. So two stills from the film, top and bottom, and in the corner, the classic Wilhelm Hammerstroy, a lone woman sitting in the light of a window. The model is nearly always his wife, Ida Ilsted, and they live a very quiet, enclosed life, apparently, according to their paintings. You often see the back of her, she's reading or sitting sewing, and the whole thing has this sort of, well, it has this poetry to it of silence. These two are typical because I'm afraid they are rather repetitive, inevitably. The one on the left is 1889. The one on the other side is 1900, but in one she's reading and in the other possibly sewing. So I'm comparing it here to a famous Vermeer, again on the theme of reading a letter. And by the way, we've had a lot of work done on this painting recently. We know that immediately behind the figure of the girl, there's a giant Cupid. So she's likely to be reading a love letter. However, I think we could also call Hammerstroy Denmark's Whistler. And he came in search of Whistler's London. Sadly, Whistler died in 1903, but there was an exhibition of his work at the Grafton Gallery, I believe, in 1906. And this is his rather foggy image of the British Museum. He loved fogs, and his landscapes are equally atmospheric, as you can see. Which brings me to my last section, which is really all dominated by snow, because they can really paint snow in the north. This is Gustav Feidelsted's Moonlight. He's Swedish. Yeah, it really does seem to capture the weights of the snow on the pine forest. And he too, like many, appears to have read his Ruskin and his William Morris. So he will also go in search of the good life at Rakan, which was situated on a lake. And here he is painting a beautiful river with the snowy bank to either side. But it's in farmland, by the way, Rakan. So again, it shows you how isolated it is. But the important thing is that is the basis for this really beautiful woven tapestry. Feidelsted marries an artist, Maya Hallen. Again, it's would be a really interesting lecture to see how many husband and wife teams there are at the end of the 19th century, like, of course, Mackintosh and his wife, Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh. But it's this crossing over from painting into craft or the decorative art, which again is such a feature of the fin de siècle, the 1890s. Akseli Gallen-Kallela is also very good at capturing reflections and the rippling of the water here in Lake Kaitiel, which is a beautiful painting actually in the National Gallery. There are at least half a dozen versions of this. It was a favorite motif of his. So here I love Lakeview. Again, he had a studio in Helsinki, but he also had a studio way up in the far north where he could commune with nature, painting snow and, you know, these magnificent translucent landscapes. He's very good at painting cloud towers of 1904, and I couldn't resist putting this one in because it's hard to tell, isn't it, where the land sort of ends and the sky starts, and there's also a lake which is reflecting the sky. The whole thing becomes an amazing, it's like a mosaic of colour and light. Akseli Gallen-Kallela. A theme that he really liked was the layer of the lynx, and he painted this on a couple of occasions. The version of 1906, you can see the pad marks, the paw marks of the lynx in the snow. Again, wonderfully evocative feeling of snow. Jens Williamson is Danish, but frequently travelled north to paint the mountains. Like so many of his contemporaries, he crossed over from painting into craft, into the decorative arts, as seen here in this magnificent frame. He also sort of was rather taken with the idea that you could see spirit animals in reflections in the snow and in the clouds. And along the top of the frame, that's in effect Tiffany style glass. It's completely separate, you know, it's not painted, it's freestanding. I was very lucky, I saw this in Stockholm in the Thielska Gallery. It's a monumental painting by Jen Ferdinand Williamson, who, by the way, also designed ceramics and furniture. He really crossed over into craft work. Sun over the mountains, that's again almost like a Blake-like vision, doesn't it? William Blake-like vision of nature, as does Harold Solberg's Winter Nights in Rondaine. And if you look carefully, there's a little cross there on the edge of this mountain peak, again imbuing the landscape with spiritual values. He painted this motif several times between 1901 and 1914. Again, it's become an iconic Norwegian image. And many of these works were acquired by Prince Eugen, who was never going to inherit the throne of Sweden. He had several brothers in front of him, and so could afford to devote his life to the arts. He was a brilliant painter in his own right. So Anchoring the Ships, winter of 1908, is painted by Prince Eugen. I'm then also showing you a portrait of him. And his collection is at Valmars Udde, which is his house and studio in Stockholm. And I just love the blue ones. So this is by one of the artists that Prince Eugen really favoured, Eugene Janssen. This wonderful view here over the fjord, where the lights in the water look almost like sort of fairies, don't they? Or monsters. They're the reflections of street lights. Here's another one by Eugene Janssen, which is in the National Museum in Stockholm. And that brings me to the very last section of my talk, which inevitably ends with Munch. But I wanted to remind you that there are plenty of other artists renowned for their angst at the end of the 19th century. And you might not have realized that August Strindberg, Swedish, is not just a playwright, he's also a painter. And somehow his paintings really seem to bring out his own personal angst. You're also seeing here his portrait painted by Edvard Munch. And the only really way to understand Edvard Munch is to read Ibsen. Essentially, as you'll see in a minute, I have a wonderful quote. Munch thought that he was painting Ibsen. So they're not so difficult to understand as you might have thought if you're familiar with the plays of Henrik Ibsen. John Gabriel Borkman is a typical story of tragedy, of a man falling from grace, accused of fraud. At the end, he's a banker. At the end, he goes out into the starry, starry night with Ella and dies. In the painting by Munch, you can see there two shadows or figures in the landscape. And the poster, which is in black and white, was designed by Munch for Gabriel Borkman, and the idea of the lighthouse is that Ibsen's plays shine a light into those parts, perhaps of human nature, which perhaps we have hidden. The idea again was to sort of to reveal all the hypocrisy and lies of family life at the end of the 19th century, the double standards. You know what I mean if you've read any of Ibsen's plays. And Starry Night is obviously is influenced by the beautiful painting by Vincent van Gogh, which you will find, I think, in the Met in New York. So as long as you know that it's all about Ibsen, you'll be well aware. And in particular, there was one play by Ibsen that meant a lot to Edvard Munch, and that was Ghosts, which is all about syphilis. He really did believe that the sins of the father were visited on his own family with the death of his mother and his sister, though from TB, remember. His father was deeply religious and sort of beat a sort of penitence into the young Edvard Munch, from which he never really recovered. So Ghost was the play really that Munch identified with. All the characters in an Ibsen play are really doomed to suffer, aren't they? Under the forces of destiny. And this is the quote by Munch at the bottom. He met Ibsen, by the way. They corresponded, but they certainly knew each other. I am reading Ibsen again, and I read him as me, myself. And this is one of his settings for Ghosts, performed in 1906. So The Frieze of Life is like an Ibsen play, goes through all the different stages. It has a section devoted to love, and a section devoted to death. I'm just going to concentrate on love, which appears to be at the bottom of Edvard Munch's angst, broken love affairs. Summer's Night's Dream, the voice that starts, is one of the earliest paintings associated with his Frieze of Life, and tells of his infatuation and broken love affair with Millie Fallow. Millie Fallow was a distant cousin. They have a physical relationship which appears to go wrong right from the outset, hence the title of this, Ashes, which appears to have been a penance for both. The Dance of Life sort of summarizes his relationship with women. So he's dancing with Millie in the center. It's sort of like he sort of puts this love affair on a sort of pedestal, with Tulla Larsen to either side, with whom he had a tempestuous relationship. Again, an on-off love affair. You might know that there is a denouement where, according to legend, he shoots himself in the hand during one of their particularly violent arguments. That's a bit of an urban legend, but it gives you some idea of how tempestuous their relationship was. But you're a bit like Van Gogh and his bandaged ear. You'll often see photographs. He definitely shot himself with his revolver on his left hand, I think. You'll often see him with his hand bandaged in contemporary photographs. And then showing you that it was a two-way sort of arrangement, or a two-way conversation between Munch and Ibsen. Sphinx, or Woman in Three Stages, inspires Ibsen's When We Dead Awaken in 1899. And it's about a woman who has three different faces according to the three different men with whom she is having, with whom they are having a relationship. The sort of young ingenue maiden, the mature woman in the center, and the one in black at the end, like a widow, can be read almost as a lady or a woman beyond her sell-by date. Rather like that idea. Anyway, conclusion comes with The Scream, his most famous painting. From the Frieze of Life, we have a prelude with Anxiety, which is all about the difficulties of living in the modern city, alienation, Sick Mood at Sunset. Again, you can see how we're building up to The Scream. And these amazing red skies, well, some people say it's to do with Krakatoa, had exploded at the end of the 1880s, the volcano this is, and had created all of these amazing luminous sunsets due to heightened dust particles in the atmosphere. And then please remember that the scream is nature that's screaming. So it seems very apposite for the 21st century in this era of global warming. And again, that wonderful quote, only a madman could have painted this. And certainly Munch was always on the brink of madness. And it's based, by the way, The Scream, on this Peruvian mummy, which again accounts for this sort of strange skull-like face. Anyway, not surprising after all of that, but Munch had a breakdown in 1908. And when he recovers, he's much happier. So that's a plus side. But here, painting for the Aula of the university, and all of these works, by the way, many of them are in the Munch Museum in Oslo. Again, this image of the sun takes us back to Oswald Alvaring from Ghosts. It's a terribly sad story where Oswald is the artist, completely overwhelmed by his deteriorating illness, caused, of course, by syphilis. And the end of the play is particularly heartbreaking because he asks his mother to end his life before his illness deteriorates, and he's basically sort of left a living corpse. And he says right at the end of the play, give me the sun. So towards the light, the mountain of humanity, the sun, for the Aula of the university was still looking back to this idea of the suffering artist who lives only for his art. So I leave you with my favourite painting from the north, Richard Berg here. To me, this is almost like an Ibsen play that needs to have the conversation between the two protagonists, written for us, bubbles. We know that Prince Eugen is the model for the man on the right-hand side, and the left-hand side lady is actually a well-known contemporary actress. But I just love the sort of slight sense of repression here between the two figures. You sort of feel that they want to declare their love for each other, but a bit like an Ibsen play, it's never going to happen. So this is still one of my favourite images, encapsulating a Nordic summer evening. And I hope you have enjoyed that gamble through Scandinavian art. I will hopefully be putting this up, if all goes to plan, on my YouTube site, but you might have to wait about 48 hours for it to appear there. So here is my YouTube channel. So it's Anne Anderson Art and Design History channel. I also have my own web pages where I post blogs and other information that you can have a look at later. So that's anne-anderson.com. There is actually a version of this lecture up there already at the moment, one that I gave earlier this month for another society. So don't be surprised if you go there already and find Scandinavian art ready for you to watch. But I will be putting up your version a little later on.